Hi, everybody. Uh, welcome. Welcome to all of you and good evening. I'm Michael Jacobson. I'm the director of the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance and a sociology professor at the CUNY Graduate Center. And tonight we're launching a very special 4-part series, Rethinking New York City. The series will look at some of the crucial issues facing our city as we begin to rebuild and respond to all that this last year has brought into focus. This is also an important juncture in the city as we consider who should be the next mayor and the direction that our city will take under that person's leadership. The events will all take place virtually for the next 4 Wednesdays, all at 7:30. We hope you'll continue to join in as we rethink economic recovery, culture and public space, and governing in a diverse city. We have some fabulous panelists lined up from across a variety of sectors, and I know you'll all learn a lot. This series was created in partnership by the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance, the Graduate Center's Office of Public Programs, and the Center for Urban Research. And all 3 of those entities work tirelessly to bring the scholarship and expertise at CUNY to the public through events, research, policy, and consulting, helping the public better understand the crucial issues of our time and improving vital public services. The format for tonight's panel will be a discussion that I'll moderate for 45 minutes, and then we'll spend 15 minutes answering questions from the audience. But first, let me do a series of quick introductions to the panelists. Their full bios are available online, but I want to give you a sense of who they are. First, I'll introduce First Deputy Commissioner Ben Tucker. Ben is obviously the First Deputy Commissioner. He was also he started as a police officer in the NYPD in 1972, was promoted to sergeant in 1987, and he was there for 22 years. Ben continued his service by moving over to the mayor's office and having a number of senior roles there, including the executive director of the Commission on Human Rights. He also served in senior positions in both the Clinton and Obama White House. So welcome, Ben. Professor Barry Friedman is next. Barry Friedman serves as the faculty director of the policing project at New York University School of Law, where he is also the Jacob D. Fuchsberg Professor of Law, an affiliated professor of political science. Importantly, and you should all check out the policing project online, but the policing project, which he runs, partners with both impacted communities and police in trying to bring solutions to what ails policing. And that it is an all stakeholders endeavor, and they welcome and encourage everyone to be at the table. Welcome, Barry. Liz Glazer is next. Liz, up until a few months ago, served as the director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, where she was a senior advisor to the mayor and oversaw all criminal justice policy in the city. Previously, Liz did a version of that job for Governor Cuomo, where she was deputy secretary for public safety, overseeing all the state's criminal justice agency. Liz has also held a variety of jobs at state and federal levels, including the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District. Finally, Julio Medina. In 1999, Julio founded the Exodus Transitional Community. Under his leadership, that not-for-profit has served over 10,000 participants and has, in my opinion, become one of the most successful programs and reentry programs in the United States. Julio also serves on Governor Cuomo's Council on Community Reentry and Reintegration, and he's also a fellow member of the Littman Commission, which wrote one of the first reports recommending closing Rikers Island. Julio and Exodus were highlighted in the 2004 presidential State of the Union address, and Julio was awarded the White House Champions of Challenge Award in 2016. So welcome to you all. And let's get right to it because we don't have a lot of time. So let me frame up the first question and ask you each to respond for at the most 3 minutes, and then I'll keep the conversation moving. So we are, as everyone knows, in a moment of huge historical import, given the tremendous drive for justice and police reform, especially after so many police killings of people of color, and the ongoing power and movement of the Black Lives Matter movement. And in the New York City context, we are 3 weeks away from New York City submitting its police reform plan to the governor as required by his executive officer, the executive order, and we will have a new mayor in 10 months. So to begin at a high level, I'd like each of you to take 3 minutes and talk about how you see this reform taking shape. What are the bedrock principles that should, in your opinion, drive the kind of justice and police reform you'd like to see, both in the short and long term? And after that, we'll try to get a little more specific, but let's start at that level, and I'll ask Liz Glazer to begin.
All right, a year into the pandemic, and I still can't find the unmute button, so apologies. So thank you very much, and really glad to be here with such a distinguished group. So I think just very basically, we're at a moment where it's time for a new model of how we secure our safety, one that is less police and criminal justice centric, and more rooted in community-led efforts supported by civic services. And I start by just thinking about, when we talk about police reform, well, what are police for? We are trying to sort of live peaceably together and to have thriving lives. And there are many ways to do that. And we sort of in America have chosen that the way that we do that is primarily through police, prisons, prosecutors, jails, and they've become our kind of go-to and our default. And because police are in every neighborhood 24/7, respond to command, they've also accreted all these functions that you would think kind of civic government would do, homeless outreach, mental health, and other things. I think that there is incredibly compelling evidence that there are other things that actually prevent crime and don't just respond to it after the fact. Who else is in a neighborhood 24/7? Well, families, community groups, who are very, very powerful force in shaping behavior, and all kinds of other things like access to decent jobs and housing and education and work and vibrant public places are all things that are powerful antidotes to crime, more importantly, create safety. But we don't have the same single-minded focus that we have with police and with criminal justice when we think about organizing all these civic functions. And I think, the pandemic kind of ripped the cover off of all of this. It was destabilizing in every way, and police were not the answer. So you had 25 million people take to the streets nationwide protesting policing and brutality, particularly the impacts on communities of color. Sort of one of the clearest signs that the model is in trouble, that they're sort of withdrawal of consent. You had a shooting spike that affected every big city in the country, including ours. In neighborhoods that historically have suffered most from violence, but also suffered from social conditions that incubate violence. And you saw sort of evidence of the impacts of kind of decades of disinvestment in the kinds of civic goods that might stop violence. And you saw the withdrawal of both police and residents from this current system of shootings spike, with arrests sort of falling off the map and clearance rates, meaning people coming forward to solve crimes, also falling down. And so I think, police and the criminal justice system are important, but that they should be cabined inside kind of civic goals that make New Yorkers safe. And that the current budget crisis actually gives us that opportunity to kind of re-examine and realign how we create safety. We've seen big increases in our criminal justice budget overall, Meanwhile, activity, arrests, jail, and everything else has dropped by about half over 7 years. And so I think the next step provided to us by the terrible and harrowing pandemic year is really a clear-eyed look at how we realign budgets to support neighborhoods with the kinds of services that will iteratively reduce crime and support thriving lives.
Thank you, Liz. Julio, can I ask you to go next?
Yes, you can, Michael. Thank you all. And I want to do this. I'm going to do mine opposite because I don't want you to cut me off, Michael. I'm long-winded. So I'm going to start with my conclusion first, which is, redistribution of wealth. When we start thinking about, NYPD, when we start thinking about budget, there has to be some sort of reallocation of funding. That reform is community-driven and the resources provided for that, right? That mutual trust is grounded in community practices and principles. And reform means holding people accountable, holding officers accountable. To be able to have to fight to get video a year later after a shooting, or to hear there's no rush to judgment. Let's wait till all the facts come out. I think these are historic moments where we can really change the dynamic on how NYPD operates. Real reform, not reform that is kind of just we have this, and the reform is because the governor has a mandate and there's a deadline, et cetera, but real community-driven stuff that we all believe in, that there's a mutual trust and a mutual understanding. Now I'm gonna go to my introduction. All right, so thank you all for the opportunity. This is wonderful. I want what I do want to say is, there's a moment in history right now that I hope we don't lose it. I hope we really can grasp this and really make that change that is sustaining and that really allows all of us to move forward, right? NYPD, the community, and all of us, right? Where communities aren't, there's not this adversarial relationship, right, between officer and a community member, that we can kind of begin to bridge the gap. The normalization of police brutality, right? It comes to an end here, right? Where we are calling officers out, where we're saying that there's a real hope for the future. There's a real hope for us to partner together, to work together, to make sure our community is safe together. I think, last week I heard the commissioner speak. He came up to Harlem. He was at the Harlem Chamber of Commerce, right? And I mean, listen, I gotta admit this. I love the speech. He talked about, systematic racism. He talked about, how communities of color have been disenfranchised for so long. He spoke about the powerful history of injustice in America, right? He spoke about the discriminatory practices that people of color had to endure around housing, employment, education, healthcare. He went on to acknowledge the role that NYPD has played in the mistreatment of communities of color. And I was like, yo, giving this girl a standing ovation. This is what we're talking about. But it just can't be talk. Like, come into these communities and make this work. Like, we can no longer be harmed. We want the partnership. I always say when I have an opportunity to say this, my niece is an NYPD officer in the Bronx. She's proud, the family is proud that she's there and she's doing this work, and we are proud for her. So this isn't something that I speak from as a way to say, NYPD needs to do A, B, C, and D. I speak to this from a person who has a family member who's an officer, that I want her to be safe. But, I also know that she grew up in a household where, dad was a drug addict, and, single family, all those other things. So she gets it. She understands that. And I just think there's an opportunity now for us to really look at it. When I heard the commissioner say some of these things, it just was, for me, one of those moments where we're saying, wow, there's something that we can really do here, that we can work together. Let's not be reactive. I heard Liz talk about, the gun violence. I'm afraid I don't want to see a stop and frisk 2.0 that looks a little better. We've outlined it nicer, but it ends up the same thing. And again, affects communities of color. I just think it's an opportunity for us, if we want to do this in a very real way, that we do it together, that it's driven in community, and that the resources be provided for those nonprofits in the communities to really do some of this work in a way that we can save our young people from some of this gang violence. Michael, you didn't cut me off yet, so I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I knew it was coming.
That's good timing, Julio. So Ben, this seems, Commissioner Tucker, this seems like a good time for you to take a shot. You muted, Ben?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
I lost my way with turning on the mic. I should know better by now. I mean, I've done 3,000 of these things, so my apologies. So yes, yeah, I mean, I was listening to Liz and listening to Julio, and you know, frankly, we are, I think, on the same page. You know, I've been doing this, you know, been in this business for 5 decades. And I actually didn't start in 72, Michael. I started in 69 as an 18-year-old trainee, man. So I've seen it all. And sir, no worries. I just giving you the historic context because I've seen it all. And I've been back at NYPD now for 7 years. And I came back. Julio mentioned stop and frisk, and I came back because I was watching what was happening up here in New York City, and I was not happy with what I was seeing as a result of the work, the numbers-driven policing in the prior administration. And so, with a new mayor and a federal district judge issuing a whole series of remedial measures to correct and bring back into line the issues around the outrageous stop and frisk numbers that we reached in 2011. And also a new police commissioner in Bill Bratton, who called me and said, hey, you know, did I have an interest in coming back? And I said, you know, I think I will, because I saw that as an opportunity to really think about reimagining policing in New York, in this city. And he had, you know, his vision was a commitment to the kinds of principles that both Liz and Julio spoke to in terms of community partnerships. And, you know, it's always been, I've been community oriented for, you know, since the time I came in and to the job, and it's always sought opportunities to really think about the nexus between police and community. The bottom line is if you look back at the history and you go back to 1829 and you think about the beginning of public policing, you know, citizens becoming, you know, sworn officers, that was a moment in time where Sir Robert Peel, that occurred in England, in London, in the London Metropolitan Police being created, in effect. And his principles were pretty, you know, basic and fundamental about the police and the public, you know, this notion that the police are the public and vice versa, the public are the police is really well-founded. So it makes sense. And I've always ascribed to that. That was it's no less true today than it was back in 1829. So yeah, we do have a lot of work to do, but I also will say, hasten to add that we have in New York done a lot of work in that regard, beginning with the last throughout the last 7 years, and we still have much more work to do, and certainly this reform effort that we're all speaking about maybe I think does present opportunities for us to rethink the way we do the way we police this city in a variety of ways. And so and we've been engaged, I think, in that process. And we were able to keep crime coming down even without with drastic reductions in stop and frisk, but also in terms of how we use technology and training and the kinds of tactics that make sense, focusing on counterterrorism, de-escalation, implicit bias training, crisis intervention training, all of those, you know, the training matters. And I know sometimes our critics suggest that, oh, it's always training, but training is critical to any kind of progress if you want to move in that direction. So I think, you know, we are, you know, and now with EO 203, as Michael pointed out earlier, we have roughly a month little more than a month to really submit our report and what we're proposing. But we'll be building on, we're not starting from scratch, is I guess my point. And so the progress that's been made with the Blue Ribbon Panel focused on discipline, as well as the whole opportunity to really focus on police reform and reinvention in this collaborative we have, and the opportunity there to really speak to and seek community involvement and listening in these listening sessions, roughly 85 of them that we were engaged in over time, more recently. I think will serve us all well as we, this is not about crime stats anymore, as much as it is about the trust that we build with communities we serve. So we should be doubling down on and are doubling down on that in that regard.
Right.
So thanks.
No, sure. Thank you. So Barry, you want to wrap up this segment for us?
I did it too. So I want to thank you, Michael, for having me and for being here with such a stellar group. I want to say two atmospheric things, and then I'm going to point to two specific things that we need to do. And I'm going to do that in no more than, and hopefully less than, the same 3 minutes that everybody else took. So, the first thing I want to say is here we are again, talking about police reform. And the more things change, the more they stay the same. I had a reason to be reading for something else, for a class I'm teaching, the Kerner Commission report, which was a report that was produced in the late 1960s, 50 years ago, a half a century ago, about the ills of policing in America after urban rioting. And you would have thought you were reading a document from today. I mean, it was amazing and deeply troubling. So the question is, when are we going to stop having the conversation? Like Julio says, when are we going to stop talking? And when are we going to do something? And the second atmospheric thing I want to say is, after George Floyd was killed and the protests began, there was a lot of finger pointing. There was a lot of finger pointing at the police. And not to get me wrong, the police deserve some finger pointing, but I was actually angry about that because a lot of the people pointing fingers were politicians. But where have they been for the last 1, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years? The mayors, the city councils, and in fact, the judges, who I hold hugely responsible for the way policing looks today in this country. And so this has got to be not just the community, though I'm right there with Julio about the importance of the community, but it's time all of government stepped up to play a role in what needs to happen with policing, instead of just thinking that they can bury their heads in the sand and leave it to the police to figure out themselves, because history tells us they are not going to. So what do? Well, the first thing we need to do, very much echoes Liz. I think we're very much in agreement on this. We are fellow travelers, which is that the footprint of policing is just too large. And you don't need to wonder about how we know that, or do we need protests to tell us that, because you just talk to cops. Cops will tell you, they tell me over and over and over, we're asked to do all this stuff that we are not apt to do. So why are they doing it? And I don't mean, by the way, just, behavioral issues, mental health issues and substance issues and homelessness, though those are super important. But there are huge swaths of what we ask the police to do that I wonder why. And I'm talking about everything from traffic enforcement, frankly, to forensic evidence collection. It's a scientific endeavor. It's very much science, and every year becoming more and more science, but we don't treat it that way. So it's time for a wholesale examination of what it is the police do, and to ask, are they the best? Now, and by the way, going back to my historical point, you'll hear people calling for abolishing the police. You can't help but not be surprised if you realize that people were saying exactly the same things 50 years ago, and things do not look like they have changed. Now, I am not one of those people that believes that the police are going to disappear. I think there's always going to be some state-sanctioned use of force and use of law enforcement authority. Call it the police, call it whatever else you want to call it, that's likely to exist. So the second thing we have to do, though, that we never seem to do, is control those functions. This is the mantra from the policing project where I work, but we are always trying to fix things on the back end after they have gone wrong. It is always about prosecuting a cop, about a civil rights investigation, about a civilian review board. All of that's body cameras. All of that stuff is important. But when do we actually legislate on the front end, like we do in the rest of government, to tell the police what it is the democratic government expects out of policing and what it does not want to see out of policing. And it's time that we step up and do that as well.
Thank you, Barry.
You're welcome.
So before I go on, I know Liz wants to follow up on a point you made, so let's do that, and then we'll move on to the second piece of this. Liz?
So I just cannot agree more with the Kerner Commission report, and I would raise just one other thing. You know, in the 1930s, there were riots in New York, in Harlem, because the community was concerned, it turned out, ended up not being the case, but that the police had killed a young boy. And LaGuardia put together a huge commission to identify what the causes were and what the solutions could be. And if you read that in the Kerner Commission report side by side, they're identical. And what are the investments that people say have to be made? It's like, before we even get to the police, education, jobs, decent housing. And here we are again. You look at Brownsville, you look at any of the top 10 neighborhoods that lead the city in shootings, even today when shootings are so much lower than they used to be. And almost 8 out of 10 of them are the same that led in the early 90s. And those are the same neighborhoods that have suffered from intense disinvestment that has been manifested in all these cruddy, like, social conditions. So it's the reason why I sort of feel that it's actually not a long-term goal. It is a short-term, immediate thing to address, to shift the frame from, you know, under the sink with the wrench with police and criminal justice, although much to be done there, and that we organize all these civic goods that we have in a way that supports neighborhood strength.
Thanks, Liz. And can I, before I get to the next question, Ben, can I follow up with you? I mean, you know, Barry had mentioned this issue of, you know, cops thinking they do too much. And I mean, this issue has been floating out there. You know, are there things that the police are doing that they shouldn't be doing, that the community itself should be doing? Let me just ask you, where, you know, what do you think about that sort of generally? And are there specific issues from your point of view you think makes sense to really think about transferring from the police to community? You're muted, Ben. Uh-oh. Yeah, Ben, you're still muted. Well, I'll give it 10. We can come back to this if, oh, there you are. Oh,
Okay, I'm back.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I was about to say that I think you know, Barry's point is spot on. I don't disagree, and he's heard it from the mouths of our officers. And yeah, I think it's one of those things that over time, in much the same way that Liz spoke about the inertia in our government in terms of how we cope with the systemic challenges around housing, around education, and so forth. Those things are the things that we've not focused on in ways that are needed. When you add the crime equation to it, and to you know, the social challenges that exist out there, and there's really no other alternative for people when they need help. They're going to pick up the phone and call 911 or 311, and the police are going to show up, and we will show up every single time, and to try and get the job done and deal with it. And I think most of the time, those things end well, and too often they don't end well, depending on the nature of the call. And so yeah, I think we do have to you know, focus on that, and this you know, this cycle of reform that we're discussing, the most recent cycle, speaks to this reform, and it is highlighted, I think, this idea of what is it, the question of what is it that policing how should policing change? What is it that the police department should the business that it's in, what should be taken off of our plate? And I think that the discussion, that's the right conversation to have. We just need to figure out what that looks like as it relates to government, but also mostly what we hear from citizens, and also just what we think makes sense. This is not rocket science in many ways. There's lots of things that we can point to, and we have begun, I think, that process in some ways, in partnership with some communities at the very local level already. But there needs to be, I think, as we go forward, this conversation is one we need to have, and it's one that the next mayor will have to struggle with in many ways, along with the elected officials at both the city council level and no doubt at the state level as well. Thanks,
Ben. So I'm gonna, for fear we'll run out of time, I was gonna ask two sort of separate questions, but I'm a little concerned if I do that, we'll sort of run over. So let me ask a two-part question for each of you, and maybe start with Julio. I mean, a number of you, understandably, have brought up this issue about police-community relations, and I mean, they're obviously, in order for the police to be seen as legitimate, you need a trusting relationship between police and community. That seems sort of axiomatic. But I want to talk a little bit specifically about, and start with Julio, about how you actually see that happening. Like, what does it entail to do that, both on the part of the community, Julio, as well as the PD? You yourself are a community leader. You run a not-for-profit in East Harlem. You deal with the community, the people you serve, the police every day. I mean, what is it that both the community and police have to do to really have a meaningful, trusted partnership? That's the first part of the question. And then the second is, I don't want to leave the discussion part of this without each of you laying out two or three things very specifically you think, because we're going to have a new mayor in less than a year, what are two or three things you think the mayor has to do right up front through executive action and legislation to deal with some of these issues? So each of you, again, take 3 minutes. Let's start with the sort of community piece and sort of how that gets actualized, and then a couple of recommendations for the mayor. So Julio, let's start with you.
Sure. So thank you, Michael, again. So first of all, I think I want to put this conversation around a sense of urgency, right? We're having a conversation, but we really have to start thinking about a sense of urgency. So, 50 years from now, there's not another report that people are reading that talks about the same thing that the Kerner report talked about. I didn't read the Kerner report, but I'm an old school, listen to rap music, and I could tell you the things that they said 30 years about NYPD. They're saying the same things in the music that they're saying today. So not much has changed. With that said, we're really talking about a culture shift. I mean, when we think about NYPD, right, if we don't think this way, we will continue to rehash over and over some of the same challenges that our community have faced, right? And I think, when we think about this, we really have to think about trauma. Now, Ben, I want to thank you too for coming on, brother, because you're surrounded by us, so I appreciate that. But I do want to say, I was stopped last year. My 15-year-old son was with me in the car. I do this work all the time. I work with NYPD. I work with the community. I work with the mayor's office. You know what I did? Put your hands on the dashboard and don't move. Don't move, Noah, for nothing. I put my hands on the steering wheel. This is what I'm teaching our children, and this is what our communities are learning. So when I talk about a culture shift, when I talk about the trauma that my 15-year-old son just experienced for nothing but being a man of color, a big 15-year-old kid, if we're not talking about a culture change, we're putting a Band-Aid on a very real problem. We're putting a Band-Aid on something that, we have to be able to find a cure to do this, right? This is happening to all of us, right? This is affecting our communities in a very real way. Michael, I think when we think about a trusted partnership, we're talking about, in reality, we are trying to erase the memories, right, of a George Floyd being executed in public, right? So I just want to make sure this is grounded in reality. This is grounded in something that's really community driven and we all understand. So again, I want to say, I think one of the first things for this trusted partnership is for NYPD, for the police department, to be able to be transparent as possible, to be able to say, you know what, we were wrong when we did this. We were wrong. And I think it begins some of the healing, because the traumatic experiences that we have from our communities have experienced with NYPD, and it's people of our color, right? So this isn't a race issue. This is an authority issue, right? This is folk from our community that decided to say, you know what? We now want to govern in a way that's, really takes away from what NYPD should be about. So I want to just say that we have to root this in something that's really transformative. Anything else is going to be a Band-Aid. And I want to again keep this at the forefront when we talk about these community partnerships and what's going to make it work. This investment in the communities has to be real. It just has to be. This redistribution, this reallocation of some of the wealth that happens at NYPD, at some of that budget, it has to be. We really have to stop and say, no one wants to have that conversation. No one wants to have the conversation of, hey, let's put pieces of this in other areas, right? Let's really look at community organizations that work. Let's look at nonprofits down the ground that doing the gang intervention work that can really help this process. So again, in closing, I just think it's important that, we don't rush again. I don't want to see a stop and frisk 2.0. I don't want to see anything that's flowery. What I want to say is this is a historic moment that we can do some real change. We have to reallocate funding. We have to begin a real partnership. How do we make this work? And I want NYPD, I want you to come to my office. I want you to be in a nonprofit space. I want to show our young people that, no, this is not an adversarial relationship. They're here to work with us. But again, we each have to take steps. The community has to take a step towards you, and we have to and NYPD has to take a step towards us. And I think that's one of the first steps that we can do and hopefully reimagining policing in the future.
I don't want to let you go, Julio, without at least, just a 2, 3, whatever, quick, what should the next mayor do sort of immediately to start hopping on these issues as sort of with as much specificity as you can think of?
Sure. Reallocate funding.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Barry, can you take a shot at both parts of that question?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to pick up right where Julio was with the reallocate funding, but I got bad news and a view about what needs to happen, which is a lot of folks want to reallocate funding from the police to other things, but you will never address the depth of problems that you're getting at if that is where you think you are going to find the money. I mean, you're just deluding yourself.
Right.
I'm writing this academic paper called What is Public Safety? And we always think, public safety is the police running around keeping you safe from somebody else. Public safety is people having adequate housing and food and, opportunities and jobs and education. And if you want to eliminate a lot of the things that people think about as crime, and I am not a kind of naive, 1960s liberal about this, it is pragmatically true, and you got to find the money for that. And there's a lot of wealth in this city. I see a lot of that wealth every single day. And it's time that we actually think about trying to address these problems, and it ain't going to come out of the police budget and fix them. So that's one thing. The second thing that I guess I want to say is it's time to do that inventory, the kind of thing that I think everybody on this program is talking about what the communities need. We need to go to the folks in the communities and say, what is it that you need? And then figure out how to get it there in some way other than an armed officer. I mean, we're not going to solve these problems, with force and law. They're not born out of force and law, and they're not going to get solved with it. And one of the things that astonishes me, as much as the things that you read in the Kerner Commission report or anything else from the 1950s and 1960s about policing and racial injustice and brutality or use of force, the thing that astonishes me is that policing has not evolved. It has not figured out ways to keep places safe without stops and frisks. And I don't believe it. I've seen plenty of evidence, and I don't think that does the job. Now, it's evolved into surveillance technologies because technology swept along, but we're not being thoughtful about those technologies either. So I think we got to go to the communities and find out what we need. I think we got a budget to meet those needs. We're not going to cover it all. I know that. I don't think anybody's unrealistic that way, but we have to do better. We need to do a complete inventory of what it is that we ask the police to do and how it can be done better. And then finally, I just going to say some words folks don't want to hear, which is it's time to create front-end accountability around policing, which is to ask the question why we simply say to the police, keep us safe, and then we just don't take a hand in asking about the methods and regulating them. And that's the mayor's job, but the mayor is not the right, it's a ridiculous way to think that you control policing by having a mayor who can hire and fire a police commissioner. Like that's wholesale regulation. It makes no sense at all. It's time for the city council to do its job, or it is time to have a police commission in this city that LA has that actually helps set the rules about how policing is going to happen and is responsive to community needs.
Thanks, Barry. Liz, and then Ben, I'll just ask you to both be as succinct as possible so we have some time for questions, both on the community issue and what should the next mayor do.
So I think this issue of day-to-day supervision of not just the police, but the criminal justice system more generally is absolutely crucial. We have a deputy mayor for housing and infrastructure that figures out whether or not we're building enough units of affordable housing. We do not have that same accountability for the justice system. What is it supposed to produce? And particularly, what are the police doing? So how is it possible that we could have had the kettling incident in June in Mott Haven that's been written about extensively, lawsuit, et cetera? Then we have kettling again in, around the election. Then we have kettling again and other kinds of not optimal policing around Martin Luther King Day. It's just an example of, I think, what Barry was saying, which is it's go police, we'll check in with you later. I think the second thing that is absolutely crucial is that there be some kind of radical transparency about not just what police do, but what the whole parts of the criminal justice system do, and what are those budgets for? And that we have almost a zero-based accounting of how we spend that money. We have dropped the activity of the criminal justice system by half in 7 years, but the budgets keep on going up, including this year's budget, the preliminary budget that's now in front of the city council. So that's the second thing that I would do. And I would do a very rigorous cost benefit of, how much safety do you get by investing in crisis management or reentry programs or whatever, summer youth employment versus some other things. It's just inconceivable to me that we have 35,000 cops and we've essentially had 35,000 cops as crime has dropped, over the past 20 years. So something is off. I don't totally get that. And then I think the last thing I would do, there are a lot more, is that I would support having, again, sort of what Barry said, is that we should go to communities directly with this radical transparency of how things are laid out and figure out with them, what is it that actually police have to do, must do, we want them to do, and what is it that others should do? There are lots of communities across the nation and the globe in which there are civilian patrols that do a whole array of things. You know, we always talk about cure violence, but there are a ton of other things. And I think there should then be a standing paid neighborhood engagement sitting at a table with city agencies and CBOs every month, looking specifically at, are we hitting our markers on whatever the thing is, jobs, cleaning up Betsy Head Park, whatever the goals are that bring a civic frame to creating safety.
Thanks, Liz. Ben, you want to try to quickly take us home, and then we'll
Sure.
switch to some questions?
Yeah, sure. I just an observation though, and and I think Barry's point is correct, but I think the way he thinks about it is a little bit. I'm not sure I agree with his thinking around the budget, but there's and I don't think I think we all have to talk about what that looks like. But I mention that only because the budget for NYPD is 90+% of it is personnel budget. So when people think about taking money away from NYPD, and this kind of gets at the point that Liz referenced, as she talked about 35,000 officers back then and 35,000 officers today, even though we brought crime down to the lowest ever since the 50s, is all true. But what is also true is what we spoke about earlier, and that is we've been asked to do more in a variety of ways. And so it gets back to the conversation that this next mayor, whoever that is, has to have, focus on this larger question, particularly in light of the resource issue and the investment in, communities being very much involved with the way in which police their communities. And so some of that is happening now. And by the way, the other thing is, I think very often these kinds of conversations, are held in a way or take place in a way where there's really, there are generalizations about, what we need to get done because we feel that we know that we've got issues and problems, but they discount, I think, and overlook, some of the profound changes, in my view, anyway. Because I remember what NYPD was when I came in, and I can tell you that it is 180 degrees away from what it was then. Doesn't mean it still doesn't need work, but there's this we have. I talked when I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks about sort of reimagining this whole policing in the context of building and keeping our neighborhood policing approach going with a view toward community empowerment. And I think we're still we are engaged in a variety of ways, particularly with young people, in doing just that. We're really connecting young people to us, having conversations with them, getting them to trust us in a variety of ways, and bringing them into even talking with them about the possibilities of joining the department and that sort of thing, and focusing on in ways that really I think will make a difference. So yeah, I mean, yeah, budget is important. We have continued to try and change culture, and some of the challenges we've had with that have to do with and we've been, I think, somewhat successful in terms of just the diversity of the agency.
So Ben, I'm sorry. I just
Go
want
ahead.
to
I'm
give.
sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I just want to get. I know Barry wanted to respond to one of your points, and I do want to get to some of the questions from the audience. But Barry, quickly.
I just wanted to say that, Ben, you misunderstood me. I was actually saying, or I was unclear. I was actually saying people who think they can solve the budgetary problem by taking the money from the police department and putting it somewhere else don't understand the scope of the budgetary problem. It's going to take a lot more than that to address the things that Liz is talking about. The police budget ought to reflect what do we think the police should do, and then what does it take to do that?
Right. No, we're on the same page then, Barry. Thank you for the.
So
for
let
the
me,
clarification.
so I've been trying to curate this growing list of questions and comments, which are great. So let me group. I'll start to try to think about them thematically. I mean, there are several. Maybe each of you could take a minute to talk about this on what the role of the unions both is and should be. I mean, they're clearly seen as an agent that resists change and retrograde. I'm trying to, I'm quoting some of the questions, but how in all of this do each of you think about the role of the unions and what sort of strategy should, again, a next mayor think about? Barry, you want to start us off on that?
Well, I'd say two things, one of which responds to one of the questions in the Q&A. So first, somebody asked me what I meant by LA. Los Angeles has a police commission that is run by individuals from the public, and they set final policy for the department, like the rest of government. Members of the public should be doing that. And so when it comes to the unions, people complain about union contracts all the time, but who signs them? The union doesn't sign them. I mean, it's time for civic officials to decide what's okay and what's not okay in police contracts. And so, again, this is one of those situations where, the unions have to decide which side of this they want to be on, and they're very often on the wrong side. But at some level, we need to stop just looking to the police and policing institutions to fix themselves and start to look at the rest of society to fix those institutions. It is our job.
Liz?
I think Barry has it exactly right. It has to be more than just, the police being responsible for fixing the unions. It's a municipal function, so.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in on this particular question, or should we move on? There are a couple of sort of similar questions around the role of the city's business community in this. I mean, is there a role other than sort of opining? I mean, does anyone see anything useful for them to do or be asked to do? I mean, it's, they are some version of
I'll make a comment here. I think, it's to me, that question is obvious. I mean, the answer may be obvious, I think, which is they have a role. Absolutely. They have a vested interest in the safety of this city, and certainly it's in their best interest to really be partners with. When we talk about community, it all depends on how we define community, right? I define community in the broadest possible context, and would include businesses, as well as the neighborhoods where our people live, communities and community organizations, and so forth. It's a wide swath, and all I'm simply saying is that anyone who lives and works and has a business and resides within the boundaries of our 325 plus miles, has a vested interest in the city. And we need to all be on the same page as much as we possibly can, notwithstanding our differences, notwithstanding our economic wealth. All of those things are, I think, we are inextricably connected. And that sounds, I think that's true. And I think we haven't, it's difficult, but I think we have to make some efforts. And the mayor is, as the leader of our government, I think, has the ability and is in the position, along with elected officials, and the citizens play a huge role there to be engaged, because we send our politicians to these offices, and we should have higher expectations of what of them in terms of what we know we need or want, on whether we're thinking about it within the criminal justice context or in public safety in the broader context, about how we regulate certain activities, whether they're bicycles or whether they're, it's how transportation is run and so forth. So it is, in my view, that's the kind of conversation. It has to be comprehensive, And if it is, then you can begin to, I think, begin to solve some of these problems. Business improvement districts, didn't exist many, many years ago, and now they do. And I think they've played a really helpful role in many ways in many parts of the city. And so those are the kinds of conversations, and we have some of these things in place now. We should think about how we build them.
Okay, thanks, Ben. And Vivian Nixon asked, is sort of posing a general question, and maybe Julio, I'll ask you to take a shot at this, just on the, how powerful the issue of trauma is, especially trauma. I'm interpreting this now experienced in communities of color, communities that are over policed, and victims of police violence. And I know the trauma issue is something you have thought about a lot. So can you respond to, how you think about that, and given the power of trauma and the long lasting nature of trauma, how do we start to think about overcoming it in this sphere?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Vivian. And I think, trauma lives in our DNA, right? This is something we don't get rid of. This is something that just doesn't go away. One of the things Exodus is doing is we're creating a trauma center. We have a full-fledged, 3-year grant, a district attorney's office to be able to run a center for trauma innovation. And when we're talking about trauma, we are talking about a plethora of challenges that one faces. When we think about the prison experience, right? When we think about people that are locked up, people that are just stopped, right? Doing the stop and frisk. The time that I was stopped in my car, those are traumatic experiences that will live with us from today till we die, till we go in the grave. And there's not enough resources to really talk about trauma. Those things just don't happen. So I think one of the things, as we think about community and we think about community trauma, we really got to think about what's the role, and if there's a role for NYPD to play in this. And I'm going to tell you, we had a young man that was murdered in our group 3 years ago out of Wagner Projects, gang violence. And we did a debrief with the other kids in the same group. And you know what? I sat there and I'm like, it wasn't about, oh man, it's sad what happened. It's, I ain't going out like that. They're not gonna catch me like that. I'm gonna have my gun ready. It was a challenge around the trauma. It wasn't a, man, let's mourn. Let's figure out that we can live a different way. It was more about, how do we defend ourselves to make sure that doesn't happen to us? So I think, Ben, when we think about trauma, when we think about kind of, our communities, when we think about reform, the thread that must run through all of this is that thread of trauma. We have to be able to look at those intersections and say, how do we really effectively do this work to make certain our young people are growing in a way that, again, is not these adversarial relationships with NYPD and our young people. So, it's again, a wonderful opportunity for us to have this discussion. I'm glad we're all at the table to really talk about this, but this has a lot of parts to it. And we really have to put our arms around it. And again, not a Band-Aid, but to be able to say we want to do some true healing.
I would just an observation, just to throw this in there, because, trauma, I could hear the trauma in your voice when you described the incident with you being stopped, right? And your hands on the steering wheel. But I think when we talk about trauma, it's like this damn virus that's got us all, for this last year, that it doesn't hate, doesn't love, it just has no feeling. It just is a virus, and it's going to do what it does, right? Mm-hmm. And trauma is very much that way. Mm-hmm. And so, the trauma that we feel that hangs in the air of the city is very much, it touches cops just like it touches, listen, nobody sees more trauma in their daily work than police officers. Mm-hmm. Of course, EMTs do, sometimes firemen do. But it's certain that trauma, we see people at their worst, and we're going into their homes, I still have trauma about before we changed our domestic violence laws. When I was a young cop and going into people's homes, and women were assaulted by their significant other, and we weren't making arrests in those days. So the trauma there, some of that still lives in my head because I had kids, hiding under beds and in closets, and you'd walk out of that apartment and you didn't do anything, and these kids were in that mode. So trauma is very real, and I think Julio's comments and my comments don't even scratch the surface with respect to the scope that it has and the impact that it has. So just one more thing to add to that list of the public health side and the mental health side.
Thank you, Ben. Well, we have gone 2 minutes over, and we try to be respectful of everyone's time, but I certainly want to thank everyone who joined us, and I apologize for not getting to more of your questions, and certainly to the panelists for being really thoughtful and giving us their time. So thank you, everybody, for doing this. I really appreciate it, and be sure to tune in to the next one a week from today. Thank you all.